Mr. President,
The senator from Wyoming.
I move to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
I further ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak in favor of my Congressional Review Act resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 59, and its House companion, House Joint Resolution 109, a joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 U.S. Code of the rule submitted by the Securities and Exchange Commission relating to Staff Accounting Bulletin No. 121. Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, or SAB 121, is a rule under the Administrative Procedure Act, disguised as an accounting guidance. It was published by the SEC staff without the approval of the majority of the commission. Accounting guidance is not something that normally would catch the attention of Congress. But in this case, a bipartisan group in the Senate and House has uncovered serious concerns with SAB 121 and the actions of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nearly 2 years ago, I started this process by sending a request for a legal opinion on SAB 121 to the Government Accountability Office. That office found that SAB 121 is, in fact, a rule and subject to the Congressional Review Office. Shortly after this finding, I introduced the Senate resolution to overturn this guidance in the Senate, and Congressmen Mike Flood and Wiley Nichols introduced the House companion. I congratulate them and House Financial Services Chair Patrick McHenry on the strong bipartisan passage of this resolution in the House. Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 puts consumers at risk by requiring a covered institution to place consumer assets on its balance sheet. It gives creditors a way to claim those assets in the event of a bankruptcy. We have seen how this plays out for consumers. Their assets are frozen for months or even years while the bankruptcy plays out. In some cases, they lose their assets entirely. Now, they've entrusted these assets to the custodian. It is the custodian that is in bankruptcy, and yet their assets are the assets that are at risk. So this does not protect consumers at all. Under SAB 121, the ownership of more than $100 trillion in assets placed for safekeeping with America's custodians are in jeopardy. The safest place for digital assets is in a self-hosted wallet, but not everyone can custody their own digital assets, including institutional investors that the SEC requires to use a qualified custodian. Regardless of what each senator thinks about digital assets, they should want consumers and institutional investors to have the option of placing their assets in the safekeeping of prudentially regulated institutions. Unfortunately, Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 prevents this by placing customer assets on the balance sheet of the custodian. SAB 121 also means that capital requirements apply. Banks would have to hold as much as $1 of capital for every dollar of customer assets. As much as the SEC would have you believe otherwise, the bank regulators have no discretion on this point. Banks must follow U.S. generally accepted accounting principles when calculating capital requirements. Finally, SAB 121 demonstrates how the SEC will push forward its regulatory agenda at the cost of transparency and the stakeholder input that is required by law. The Senate could have avoided this if SEC Chair Gary Gensler was willing to direct staff to revise Accounting Bulletin 121 to keep customer digital assets off the balance sheets of custodians and engage in a transparent process. Refusing to revisit this policy after bipartisan criticism is odd. The majority of the SEC staff accounting bulletins from the last 30 years have been revisions and rescissions of prior guidance. Revisiting and fixing accounting standards, especially when there's a new technology, is warranted and encouraged. Guidance is meant to be flexible. It is not meant to set policy, which would require notice and comment by those that will be regulated pursuant to that regulatory process. But apparently, Chairman Gensler would rather politicize accounting standards to achieve policy goals in the banking industry, an industry I'd like to remind him he does not regulate, rather than conduct a transparent policy-making process. Maybe it's because Chairman Gensler knows that putting customer assets on the balance sheet is bad policy that would garner enough support to finalize a rule, or rather would not garner enough support to finalize a rule. Maybe it's because he's committed to an ill-informed and unworkable fight against the digital asset industry at any cost. Unfortunately, SAB 121 does nothing to protect consumers, nothing to protect consumers. It hurts them. I hope that all of my colleagues will recognize this and join me in voting in support of House Joint Resolution 109. Mr. President, I yield the floor.